Picture a Roman soldier stationed at Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, roughly 130 AD. He is cold. He is far from home. He misses his mother's cooking, the smell of the Mediterranean, and the general concept of warmth as a reliable feature of daily life. He has just finished his morning duties, which in the military context of the Roman Empire involved a communal latrine, a long stone bench with holes cut into it, positioned over a channel of flowing water, shared with approximately a dozen other soldiers doing the same thing at the same time with no dividing walls or privacy of any kind, because Romans were not squeamish about bodily functions in the way that later cultures would become. And when he finishes, he reaches for the xylospongium. The xylospongium is a sponge attached to a short stick. It sits in a communal vessel of salt water or vinegar water, positioned within reach of the latrine bench. He uses it, rinses it in the vessel or in a separate channel of running water, and returns it to the communal container for the next person. This is not a personal hygiene item. This is a shared toilet implement used by every soldier who occupies that latrine bench across the course of the day, cleaned between uses with varying degrees of thoroughness depending on the water quality, the soldier's conscientiousness, and how busy the latrine happened to be at any given moment. The modern reader, encountering this information, typically passes through a sequence of reactions. Initial disbelief, followed by the dawning comprehension that yes, this was a real and documented practice, followed by a prolonged moment of personal reflection about the hygienic standards of their daily commute. But here's what's worth noticing. The xylospongium represents a relatively sophisticated sanitation solution by the standards of most of human history. The Romans had running water, a shared cleaning implement, and an infrastructure for waste removal via flowing channels. A significant portion of humanity, across a significant portion of our history, had considerably less than that. So, what did ancient humans actually use before toilet paper? The full answer spans 200,000 years of human history, covers every inhabited continent, involves materials ranging from the elegant to the alarming, and reveals a great deal about how human civilization organizes itself around the universal biological requirements that no amount of cultural sophistication makes optional. Before excavating the historical record, it's worth establishing what toilet paper actually is and when it arrived, because its recency is more startling than most people realize. Paper itself was developed in China around 100 to 200 AD, though earlier prototypes existed somewhat before that. The recorded use of paper for personal hygiene appears in Chinese texts from the 6th and 7th centuries AD. A court official of the Sui dynasty noted with some evident concern about sacrilege that he was reluctant to use paper bearing the names of respected scholars for such purposes. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the practice of using paper for hygiene was documented as widespread in China. But this was China. The rest of the world did not have widespread access to paper for hygiene until far later. In Europe, mass-produced paper was not available until after the development of the printing press in the 15th century, and even then, paper was expensive enough that using it for hygiene was a luxury rather than a standard practice. The first commercially produced toilet paper as a dedicated product appeared in the United States in 1857 when Joseph Gaiety marketed medicated paper specifically for the purpose. Perforated rolls on a holder, the form familiar today, arrived in the 1890s. Global adoption spread through the 20th century and remains incomplete. Significant portions of the world's population today use water-based methods rather than paper for hygiene. The period during which toilet paper was a universal standard globally is shorter than many living people's lifespans. The period during which any paper at all was used for hygiene is a small fraction of recorded human history. And recorded human history is itself a small fraction of the total span of anatomically modern human existence. Which means that for the overwhelming bulk of human time on this planet, the answer to what did people use was something else entirely. Let's examine what that something else was. Water is, by the metric of global distribution and historical continuity, the most widely used cleaning method in human history, and it remains so today across large portions of the world. The logic is straightforward and physically sound. Water physically removes material from surfaces through mechanical action, and targeted water application to the relevant anatomy after toilet use is more hygienic in absolute terms than dry wiping with any material. Modern bidets, the Lota vessels of South Asian practice, the Shataf spray attachments common in Middle Eastern bathrooms, and the anal douche practices of various cultures all represent variants of the same fundamental approach. Use water. The water method appears across virtually every agricultural civilization with access to reliable water supply. Islamic hygiene codes, codified in texts from the 7th century onward, mandated the use of water for post-toilet cleaning and specified the hand and technique to be employed. A level of systematic attention to toilet hygiene that most of medieval Europe was not applying to the topic at all. The lota, a small vessel, traditionally copper or brass used to pour water for hygiene, has been in continuous use across South Asia for documented millennia and remains standard practice across hundreds of millions of people today. Various East Asian cultures incorporated water-based hygiene methods as the standard approach. The hand is, obviously, the applicating tool in most water-based cleaning methods, which immediately raises questions about contamination management that were not always answered adequately in ancient contexts. The practice of reserving the left hand for toilet hygiene and the right hand for eating and social interaction, found across multiple cultures that used water-based methods, is a hygiene protocol developed to limit the transfer of fecal contamination to food and social surfaces. It is not a perfect solution, particularly in contexts where soap for hand washing was unavailable, but it represents a systematic behavioral adaptation to the contamination risk that the method creates. The epidemiological consequences of inadequate hand washing after water-based toilet hygiene are real and significant. Fecal-oral transmission of pathogens, including those causing typhoid, cholera, hepatitis A, and various parasitic infections, has historically been a major source of illness and death in populations relying on water methods without adequate soap for hand washing. This is not an argument against water-based hygiene, which remains more thoroughly cleaning than dry methods. It is an acknowledgement that the method requires the full protocol to be effective as a disease prevention strategy. For hunter-gatherer populations, representing the mode of human existence for the vast majority of our species' history, the question of what was used for toilet hygiene was answered by whatever the immediate environment provided. Leaves are the obvious and most frequently cited answer, and they were indeed widely used across forested and vegetated environments globally. But leaf selection was not arbitrary, and the accumulated knowledge of which plants to use and which to avoid represents an important category of environmental knowledge in traditional communities. Certain leaf properties make a given plant useful: appropriate texture for mechanical cleaning without abrasion, sufficient structural integrity to function without tearing, adequate size, absence of irritating sap or chemicals that could cause contact dermatitis in sensitive anatomy. Plants with soft, large leaves, mullein, large-leaved dock, various tropical plant species, were specifically identified by communities as appropriate for this use, and were, in some cases, deliberately located or cultivated near dwelling areas. Plants with inappropriate properties were dangerous alternatives. Various plant families produce saps that are potent skin irritants. The Euphorbiaceae family in particular, which includes many common plants, produces irritating latex saps. Poison ivy and its relatives produce urushiol, a contact allergen that produces severe dermatitis. Using the wrong leaf in a context where the resulting dermatitis was in an anatomically inconvenient location was, presumably, an educational experience that did not need to be repeated. The traditional knowledge specifying which plants were appropriate and which were not was practical knowledge with genuine health implications. Beyond leaves, various plant materials were used: grass clumps in grassland environments where large leaves were unavailable, corn husks in agricultural communities across the Americas after maize cultivation became widespread, moss in northern forest environments where soft, absorbent plant material was available, coconut shells and husks in tropical island environments, palm leaves, and their fibers across tropical regions globally. The common thread is the exploitation of whatever locally available natural material best approximated the mechanical cleaning function required. The archaeological record provides more direct evidence of ancient hygiene practices than most people would expect, though interpreting that evidence requires some careful reading of the material. Ancient latrines, where they survive archaeologically, tell a remarkable range of stories about how different cultures organized the physical act of waste disposal. The Roman latrina, the communal latrine structure found across the Roman world from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East, was a sophisticated piece of sanitation infrastructure. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Stone or marble benches with cut holes, positioned over channels carrying flowing water that continuously removed waste, often incorporated into bathhouse complexes, occasionally heated, sometimes elaborately decorated. The xylospongium described at the opening of this exploration has been recovered archaeologically from several Roman latrine sites, providing direct material evidence for its use. Medieval European latrines, the garderobe, in castle architecture, were considerably less sophisticated. A small chamber projecting from the exterior wall of a stone building, with a seat positioned over an opening that dropped waste directly down the exterior wall face to the ground or into a pit below. The limited hygiene provisions associated with these structures and the absence of running water meant that whatever cleaning was done was accomplished with whatever dry material was immediately available, typically straw, hay, or scraps of fabric in more affluent households. Ancient privies excavated in various contexts across Europe and the Americas frequently contained seeds, fragments of plant material, and occasional textile remnants that represent the cleaning materials deposited there during use. Botanical analysis of privy contents has in several cases provided direct evidence of the plant materials used. Large concentrations of specific leaf material or plant fibers in otherwise typical latrine deposits indicating deliberate use for hygiene rather than incidental deposition. Ceramic shards deserve their own detailed examination because they represent one of the more counterintuitive entries in the catalog of historical toilet hygiene materials and one that has the most interesting archaeological footprint. Broken pottery shards, fragments of ceramic vessels, were used for personal hygiene across multiple ancient cultures, most notably in the Greek and Roman world. The practice is attested in ancient Greek texts, and the Latin term passoi refers to small, smooth pieces of ceramic used for this purpose. Archaeological deposits in ancient latrines at various Greek and Roman sites have yielded concentrations of small, worn ceramic fragments in shapes and quantities consistent with use as cleaning implements. Some of these ceramic fragments bear graffiti, names, typically of political figures, or personal enemies. The inscribing of an enemy's name on a toilet-use ceramic fragment was, apparently, a satisfying form of personal expression in ancient Greek culture, a twofer of hygiene and symbolic statement. An archaeological find at Athenian sites included ceramic shards bearing the name of a prominent political figure, suggesting that someone had specifically prepared personalized hygiene implements as a commentary on the individual in question. This is, depending on your cultural context, either deeply juvenile or a remarkably efficient form of political protest, and the fact that we know about it 2,000 years later says something interesting about the permanence of ceramic materials. The material properties of ceramic shards make them plausible for this use when the edges have been worn smooth. The sharp edges of fresh breaks would have been problematic, but ancient ceramic fragments in regular use would quickly have their edges worn down by handling and use. The Romans valued smooth, rounded surfaces for this purpose, which explains the worn condition of many archaeologically recovered examples. Snow and ice deserve mention as cleaning materials used by populations in cold climates, and their effectiveness is not as implausible as it might initially seem. Cold temperature application to inflamed or irritated tissue reduces pain and swelling, a property familiar from modern injury treatment. Snow is physically clean in the sense of being free from microbial contamination when freshly fallen. Its abrasive texture when packed provides mechanical cleaning action, and its melting behavior when in contact with warm tissue provides a water-based rinse component. Various northern indigenous peoples incorporated snow into personal hygiene practices, and the logic of using the cleanest, Most abundant material in the immediate environment makes straightforward practical sense in contexts where snow is that material. The obvious limitation is temperature. The physiological response to applying snow to warm anatomy in cold conditions involves a rapid opinion formation about whether this was a good idea. Practical use presumably involved snow that had been lightly warmed, or was used in a way that minimized prolonged contact. The practice is documented in ethnographic accounts of various northern peoples and represents a logical adaptation to available resources rather than an unusual choice. Textile materials, fabric scraps, wool tufts, linen rags, were used across many cultures where woven materials were available but paper was not, and the distribution of this practice tracks closely with the economic history of cloth production. In ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, where textile production was developed and cloth was a significant commodity, linen was available in various grades, and lower-grade linen scraps and remnants had uses that included personal hygiene. The wealthy used better materials, the less wealthy used whatever was available. The use of fabric for hygiene in ancient Egypt is inferred from both the general availability of linen in Egyptian material culture and from comparative practice across the ancient Mediterranean world. In medieval Europe, cloth rags were standard personal hygiene material for those who could access them. Woolen material, abundant in northern European agricultural communities where sheep husbandry was standard, provided functional if not particularly comfortable cleaning material. The same rags used for multiple purposes across a household would have been used for hygiene and washed periodically, a practice that is hygienically adequate if the washing is sufficiently thorough but creates contamination risks if it isn't. The transition from cloth rags to paper for hygiene in Europe tracks closely with the declining cost of paper through the 18th and 19th centuries. As paper became cheaper relative to cloth, the economic logic shifted, and paper was increasingly used for single-use hygiene applications. The development of commercial toilet paper as a specific product was the endpoint of a gradual economic and material transition rather than a sudden invention that replaced nothing. Ancient Rome's investment in sanitation infrastructure extended well beyond the xylospongium and the communal latrine, and the full picture of Roman toilet hygiene is more sophisticated than the shared sponge stick detail tends to make it seem. Roman public baths, the thermae, incorporated toilet facilities as standard elements of the complex, positioned near water supplies, and integrated into the water management systems that were among the Romans' most significant engineering achievements. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's ancient sewer system, channeled waste from the city's latrines via flowing water to the Tiber River. A genuine waste removal infrastructure serving a city of over 1 million people at its height. The combination of flowing water in latrines, water-based washing facilities in adjacent baths, and a sewer system carrying waste away from populated areas represented a level of sanitation infrastructure that would not be matched in European cities until the 19th century. The decline of this infrastructure after the fall of the Western Roman Empire is one of the less discussed dimensions of the medieval period's economic and technological contraction. Cities that had functioning sewer systems and public baths under Roman administration lost both over the succeeding centuries as the administrative and engineering capacity to maintain them collapsed. Medieval European cities, even large ones, typically lacked the sanitation infrastructure that smaller Roman provincial cities had possessed, with consequences for waterborne disease rates that are visible in the historical epidemiological record. The history of toilet hygiene is, at a certain level of analysis, a history of the relationship between available materials and the human preference for not being uncomfortable. No culture with access to an obviously better option chose the worse one for ideological reasons. The diversity of approaches across cultures and historical periods reflects the diversity of available materials, environmental conditions, and technological capabilities rather than any fundamental difference in the motivation to achieve cleanliness. What is remarkable, surveying the full catalog, is how inventive the solutions were within the constraints of each context. Romans with flowing water and ceramic production developed implements and infrastructure appropriate to those capabilities. South Asian cultures with reliable water supply developed vessel-based water methods and the behavioral protocols to make them safe. Northern populations with abundant soft plant materials used moss. Agricultural communities with cereal crop byproducts used corn husks and hay. Communities with appropriate leaf plants used leaves. The solution in each case was derived from what the environment and the culture's material capabilities offered. The willingness to develop solutions, to observe what worked, accumulate that knowledge, pass it through generations, and build cultural practices around it, is the consistent element. The material varied enormously. The underlying human motivation did not. The pandemic-era toilet paper shortage of 2020 produced a curious cultural moment in which large numbers of people in developed nations found themselves briefly confronting the question that the rest of human history had answered in various ways for 200,000 years. What do you use when the standard product isn't available? The responses ranged from the practical, water and a vessel, newspaper, paper towels, cloth rags, to the slightly panicked, and the whole episode was largely resolved within a few weeks as supply chains normalized. But the brief cultural conversation it generated touched something worth noticing. The assumption that toilet paper was an irreplaceable necessity rather than a recently adopted solution to an ancient problem was sufficiently widespread to make its temporary absence feel catastrophic to people who were, in the absolute scheme of things, abundantly resourced compared to most of human history. The Roman soldier at Hadrian's Wall, reaching for the communal xylospongium in the cold northern morning, was not experiencing deprivation by his own standards. He had a structured solution to a universal problem, developed by a civilization with significant engineering capability and considerable practical thought about sanitation. He was doing with the materials and infrastructure of his time and place what every human who has ever existed has had to do with the materials and infrastructure of their time and place. The materials changed. The basic human requirement did not. And the ingenuity applied to meeting that requirement across every culture, every climate, every available material set, across the full 200,000 years of anatomically modern human existence, is, when you examine it honestly, and without the reflexive squeamishness that the topic tends to produce, one of the more universal demonstrations of human practical intelligence that history contains. The xylospongium is in a museum now. The Roman who used it is dust. The wall he guarded is a tourist attraction, and the problem he was solving that morning at the communal latrine is, without any modification whatsoever, the same problem you solved this morning. Some things about being human are genuinely timeless.